In Rome, circa 200 AD, the state of the empire was dire.
Military spending consumed an astounding 75% of the imperial budget. Government debt was spiraling out of control, the currency was being aggressively debased, and wealth inequality had reached historic, dangerous highs. The political system was plagued by intense dysfunction. Costly foreign wars were continually draining vital resources, while the populace, rejecting the need for genuine reform, demanded mere distractions, specifically, bread and circuses.
Now consider America in 2025 AD. The echoes are deafening.
While military spending officially accounts for 54% of the discretionary budget, a staggering $1.5
trillion in total spending, the government debt has soared past $36 trillion. The currency has been systematically debased, losing 98% of its purchasing power since 1913. Wealth inequality stands at its highest point since the 1929 market crash. Political dysfunction is endemic, and we are mired in forever wars. Like their Roman predecessors, citizens clamor for immediate gratification, stimulus checks and endless streaming entertainment rather than demanding meaningful structural reform. The parallels are visible to almost everyone. Rome's decline, from its zenith to its ultimate fall, spanned approximately 250 years. Consequently, a pervasive narrative suggests that the American Republic is inevitably traveling the exact same historical road. This comparison is inescapable. It permeates books, documentaries, and news articles, raising the central question: are we Rome? Is this truly the beginning of the fall of the American empire? However, this is where the popular analysis fundamentally errs. The comparison itself isn't incorrect, rather, it is dangerously incomplete. The striking similarities merely confirm the trend, but they are not the true crux of the story. The defining elements are the differences. And these differences do not offer reassurance of safety. In fact, they suggest we face a far greater, more immediate danger. The reason lies in acceleration. Every structural difference between ancient Rome and modern America serves to hasten the speed of collapse, not slow it down. Rome existed in a pre-industrial age, America is post-industrial. Rome enjoyed 5 centuries of deep cultural cohesion before its crisis began. America has only existed for 250 years in total. Crucially, Rome's debt was largely internal, owed to its own citizens or subjects. America's debt is global, subject to the whims of foreign creditors. Rome's elite class generally had skin in the game, meaning their fortunes were tied inextricably to the survival of the empire. America's elite, by contrast, have meticulously planned exit strategies. Furthermore, Rome always had the option to expand territorially to solve internal resource problems, while America has nowhere left on Earth to conquer or expand into. Finally, Rome's currency debasement was evident in the physical reduction of silver content. America's debasement is invisible, hidden away in complex digital ledgers. Every single one of these distinctions acts as a catalyst, dramatically accelerating the timeline. While Rome required 250 years to proceed from its peak prosperity to its ultimate breakdown, America has arguably compressed the exact same downward trajectory into a mere 54 years, beginning in 1971. The next, final phase will not unfold over the course of another 2 centuries. Based on these accelerators, it will take 10 to 20 years at the absolute maximum. This analysis will detail every major parallel shared by Rome and America, explaining why the comparison is valid yet critically insufficient. We will examine which specific differences truly matter and detail precisely how those distinctions accelerate, rather than prevent, systemic collapse. Understanding what separates us from Rome is therefore far more vital than recognizing our similarities. Why? Because anyone preparing for a slow, 250-year Roman timeline decline will be utterly blindsided when the American timeline accelerates, moving 10 times faster. What Rome truly teaches us is not that we are simply doomed to repeat history, but that we are doomed to repeat it at a breakneck pace. The Roman comparison persists because the structural parallels are undeniable. Let's review the 7 major similarities that lead so many to conclude, we are Rome. Parallel 1, Military overextension. During its height in 117 AD under Emperor Trajan, Rome commanded territory stretching from Britain across to Mesopotamia, and from the Rhine River south to the Sahara Desert.
This vast expanse necessitated maintaining 30 legions, totaling approximately 300,000 dedicated soldiers. The core issue wasn't merely the enormous size of the military establishment, but the absolute necessity of that military for maintaining imperial control. Every single border, Germania, Dacia, Parthia, Britain, North Africa, required a presence. To withdraw from any front meant either internal revolt or being immediately overrun by external barbarian forces. Rome found itself in an impossible bind. It could not afford the military establishment, yet it was equally unable to risk cutting it.
America, 2025.
The United States currently operates approximately 750 military bases across 80 different countries, sustained by a total active duty personnel count of
1.3 million.
The official Pentagon budget stands at $870 billion, but when factoring in Veterans Affairs, $300 billion, nuclear weapons programs, $50 billion, intelligence agency spending, $80 billion, and foreign military aid, $50 billion, the actual annual defense total surpasses
$1.5 trillion. This colossal sum consumes 54% of the federal discretionary spending. Exactly like Rome, America is structurally trapped. A pullback from Europe would invite Russian expansion. Retreating from Asia would allow China to expand its hegemony. Abandoning the Middle East would hand critical oil routes to Iran. The global empire cannot afford to contract its commitments without initiating a full collapse. It is the same dilemma, involving similar percentage expenditures, and the same absolute impossibility of strategic retreat. Parallel 2, currency debasement. The Roman denarius coin in 200 AD contained 95% silver. Yet, by 268 AD, just 68 years later, that content had plunged to only 5% silver. This represented a staggering 95% debasement, and it was entirely deliberate. Emperors needed funds to maintain and pay the increasingly demanding military. They knew that raising taxes would trigger revolts, and cutting military expenses meant losing crucial territory. Their solution was to debase the currency, minting far more coins from the same limited amount of silver and paying essential expenses with effectively worthless money, thereby transferring the loss directly to the citizenry's purchasing power. Fast forward to 1971, the American dollar still held its connection to gold. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon unilaterally closed the gold window, ending the dollar's convertibility. Since that date until 2025, the Federal Reserve has injected over $20 trillion into the system. The M2 money supply surged from $600 billion in 1971 to $21 trillion today, resulting in an estimated 98% loss of purchasing power over 54 years. The mechanism, the underlying necessity, and the result are identical. The government prints money to service debts it cannot realistically afford, and citizens holding the currency suffer a catastrophic loss of wealth.
Parallel 3, extreme wealth inequality. By 300 AD, the concentration of Roman wealth had reached alarming extremes. The top 1% of the population controlled an estimated 40% of the entire wealth. Elite senators possessed vast agricultural estates known as latifundia, maintained by slave labor. The once vibrant middle class of small farmers and independent merchants had been effectively decimated by crippling inflation and excessive taxation. The urban poor subsisted entirely on subsidized food, grain, and state-provided entertainment. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing around 380 AD, noted the absurdity of senators earning annual incomes exceeding 4,000 pounds of gold, while the majority of Roman citizens languished in abject poverty.
America, 2025.
Today, the top 1% of Americans control 32% of total wealth, and the top 10% own an astonishing 67%. Meanwhile, the entire bottom 50% of the population holds only 2%.
The wealth gap has drastically widened since 1971.
50 years ago, the top 1% held 25%, that share has increased to 32%, while the share belonging to the bottom 50% has dropped from 5% to a mere 2%.
Although inflation-adjusted median household wealth has seen negligible growth since 1971, billionaire wealth has surged exponentially. In 1982, America had only 13 billionaires. By 2025, that figure exceeds 750. The result is the same: massive concentration of wealth, simultaneous destruction of the stabilizing middle class, and the same fundamental mechanism, currency debasement, serving as the engine that transfers wealth upwards. Parallel 4. Severe political dysfunction. By 200 AD, the once powerful Roman Senate had become largely ceremonial. True power resided with the emperors, who were constantly installed and deposed by the whims of the military. During the calamitous crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 AD, Rome cycled through 26 emperors in just 49 years, with most meeting their end via assassination. Civil wars were routine. The central government proved completely incapable of passing meaningful reforms because every competing faction prioritized gaining and holding power above implementing sound policy. America, 2025. Congress consistently suffers from approval ratings below 20%. Legislative gridlock has become the permanent operating condition. The last time the federal budget was balanced was 2001. All attempts at major systemic reform, be it healthcare, immigration, or tax policy, have either failed outright or been partially implemented only to be immediately challenged or overturned. Presidents increasingly bypass the legislature, governing through executive orders that are subsequently and immediately reversed by the succeeding administration. Critically, the government cannot address the looming debt crisis, the entitlement crisis, or the currency crisis, because any genuine solution demands political sacrifice and pain that no ruling faction is willing to endure. This reveals the same dysfunction, the same fatal inability to reform, and the same destructive prioritization of factional power over ensuring systemic stability. Parallel 5. Bread and circuses. The Roman satirist Juvenal, writing around 100 AD, famously coined the phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses. The Roman government strategically distributed free grain to the urban poor and heavily subsidized lavish public entertainment, including gladiatorial games, dramatic theatrical performances, and chariot races. By 380 AD, Rome celebrated 175 official public holidays annually, featuring constant entertainment. The Colosseum alone seated 50,000 spectators, and the Circus Maximus could hold 250,000 people. The objective was clear: to maintain a distracted, pacified population through subsidized food and entertainment, thus avoiding the painful necessity of addressing systemic failures. America, 2025. The modern iteration is strikingly similar. The average American consumes roughly 4 hours of television daily, supplemented by the endless, personalized distraction of streaming services, social media feeds, professional sports, and gaming. The government provides food assistance to over 42 million Americans via SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Measures like student loan forbearance, direct stimulus checks, and extended unemployment benefits all function to keep the populace docile and compliant. The parallel is exact: free bread has transmuted into food stamps, the circuses have become Netflix and the broader digital media landscape. The Roman mobs demanding bloody gladiators are now Americans fiercely arguing over which streaming platform offers superior content. The population remains perpetually distracted while the foundational systemic problems continue to compound exponentially. Parallel 6. Declining birth rates and increasing immigration. Starting around 100 AD, the birth rate among Roman citizen families began a noticeable decline. Despite government attempts to intervene, Emperor Augustus even passed laws penalizing childless adults, the efforts failed. The native citizen population dwindled, while immigration, often of so-called barbarian groups, surged. By 300 AD, a substantial portion of the Roman military consisted of Germanic tribes granted citizenship in exchange for military service. This arrangement created a profound loyalty dilemma. When the Western Empire finally collapsed in 476 AD, the army that failed to defend it was predominantly Germanic, lacking a deep cultural connection to Rome itself. Crucially, when Rome could no longer afford to pay them, these troops defected, either joining the invading barbarians or becoming local warlords. America, 2025. The U.S. birth rate is currently 1.6 children per woman, significantly below the replacement rate of 2. This downward trend has been continuous since 1971. Native-born population growth is now near zero, meaning virtually all population increase is driven by immigration. The Census Bureau predicts that by 2045, the majority of Americans will be immigrants or children of immigrants. Similarly, the military increasingly relies on immigrant recruits seeking the path to citizenship. This has yet to become a crisis. But the critical question looms: if America were to face a catastrophic economic crisis and could not afford to pay its military, would soldiers whose families have been here for only a decade fight desperately to preserve an empire that has failed to support them? Or would they prioritize their own and their families' survival? Rome's historical answer was definitive: they prioritized survival. The parallel is clearly forming. Parallel 7: External enemies at the gates. Rome faced relentless barbarian pressure across virtually every frontier: Germanic tribes to the north, Goths in the east, the powerful Persians in Mesopotamia, and Berbers in North Africa. For 2 centuries, Rome fought these enemies to a punishing stalemate. The barbarians were unable to decisively conquer Rome, but Rome, in turn, could not eliminate them. The crucial shift occurred when Rome weakened internally due to the forces of currency debasement, grotesque wealth inequality, and political paralysis. The barbarians did not suddenly become stronger, Rome simply became critically weaker. And the moment Rome could no longer afford to pay the legions, the imperial frontiers collapsed entirely. America, 2025. Our external challenges include major state actors like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, alongside various potent non-state actors. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, America has spent 30 years fighting to secure and maintain global dominance. The protracted wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya were all attempts to enforce hegemony. Yet, none resulted in lasting victory. America has not technically lost militarily, but it has certainly failed to secure a win. The costs have been staggering: an estimated $8 trillion spent on the war on terror, 7,000 American soldiers killed, hundreds of thousands more wounded, and the enemies persist. The Taliban controls Afghanistan. Russia retains Crimea. China actively militarizes islands in the South China Sea. Iran aggressively develops nuclear capabilities. The modern barbarians are positioned at the gates. They are not yet militarily overwhelming, but they are patiently waiting for the inevitable internal weakness to manifest. These 7 devastating parallels are precisely why the chorus of observers cries, "We are Rome." And they are fundamentally correct. The similarities are indisputable: military overextension, aggressive currency debasement, severe wealth inequality, political paralysis, reliance on bread and circuses, declining birth rates compensated by shifting immigration patterns, and persistent external enemies. Every comparison drawn is accurate, every parallel is valid. However, here is the singular, critical element that almost everyone overlooks. While the parallels confirm that collapse is a viable and looming possibility, the differences dictate the timeline. And those structural differences accelerate everything. I will now detail the 5 critical differences that guarantee America's decline will be dramatically faster than Rome's. Difference 1: technology accelerates everything. Rome operated in a pre-industrial world. Communication was limited to the speed of a horse, meaning a message from the capital to Britain took 40 days. Financial transactions necessitated the physical transport of gold and silver. Trade was restricted by the speed of wind and oars. This inherent slowness provided the system with immense stability through inertia. For example, when Rome debased the currency, it took years for merchants across the sprawling empire to notice the change and fully adjust their prices. When a crisis erupted in one province, it required months for the economic shock to propagate to other provinces. The empire moved slowly, therefore, the collapse moved slowly. America, by contrast, is entirely digital. Communication is instantaneous. Financial markets operate at the speed of light, with high-frequency trading executing millions of transactions per second. When the Federal Reserve announces a policy shift, global markets react in milliseconds. This velocity eradicates any systemic inertia. When the Fed manufactured $5 trillion in new currency between 2020 and 2021, global inflation manifested within 18 months. When Silicon Valley Bank failed in March 2023, 3 other regional banks failed within days, precisely because information spreads instantly, enabling bank runs to occur at digital speed. Rome's collapse took 250 years, 235 AD to 476 AD, because crises propagated slowly. America's crisis will move at digital velocity. Instead of 250 years, we should anticipate a maximum of 25 years from the crisis's initial onset to a complete systemic breakdown. We are already 15 years into this accelerated timeline. The 2008 financial collapse serves as the functional equivalent of the start of Rome's crisis of the 3rd century in 235 AD. If this pattern holds, accelerating 10 times due to technology, the American system break is likely to occur around 2035 to 2040. Difference 2: Rome could expand, America cannot. Whenever Rome encountered severe internal problems, it possessed a crucial escape valve: expansion. By conquering new territories, plundering precious gold and silver, enslaving new populations, and seizing external resources, Rome effectively purchased time. For instance, when Augustus became emperor in 27 BC following decades of devastating civil war, he achieved stability partly through successful expansion. He conquered Egypt, securing Rome's vital grain basket, and temporarily stabilized the currency using Egyptian gold. This expansionary policy bought Rome 2 centuries of relative stability. When systemic problems re-emerged around 200 AD, Rome desperately tried to expand again. Trajan conquered Dacia in 106 AD for its gold mines, and Septimius Severus campaigned in North Africa. Yet, by 250 AD, the limit was reached. There was literally nowhere left to expand. Rome bordered the massive Persian Empire, or wastelands populated by barbarians possessing nothing worth plundering. Without expansion, Rome lost its escape mechanism. Internal problems, the debt, the debasement, the inequality, could no longer be solved by importing external wealth, forcing the system into collapse. America confronts this same fundamental limit, but far sooner. Rome benefited from 500 years of territorial expansion before hitting this barrier. America hit its geopolitical limit in 1945. Post-World War II, the U.S. established dominance over the entire non-communist world. Mechanisms like the Marshall Plan, Bretton Woods, the World Bank, and the IMF functioned as sophisticated tools to extract resources and wealth from the global system. But the world is now entirely parceled out, every territory is claimed, and every resource is accounted for. There is nowhere left for America to expand territorially. The resulting alternative was financialization. Instead of conquering land, America exported its dollar currency and imported physical goods. The petrodollar system forced global actors to hold vast reserves of U.S. dollars, allowing America to print currency and make the rest of the world absorb the resulting inflation. However, that system is demonstrably ending. The petrodollar arrangement formally ceased in June 2024, and BRICS nations are actively constructing alternative, dollar-free payment systems. America's financial expansion, much like Rome's territorial expansion, has reached its maximum limit. Rome enjoyed 500 years of expansion followed by 250 years of decline after hitting the limit. America had only about 50 years of major financial expansion, 1971 to 2021, and now faces a compressed decline. The timeline is compressed fivefold because America reached the expansion barrier so much quicker. Difference 3: Rome's currency debasement was visible, America's is invisible. When Rome debased the denarius, the population could physically observe the change. A denarius in 200 AD was a large, solid silver coin. By 268 AD, the same coin was small, mostly bronze, and merely coated with a faint silver wash. Merchants could physically weigh the coins and chemically test the metallic content. This debasement was obvious and physical, which generated widespread resistance. Merchants began refusing the new, debased coins, demanding payment either in older, high silver coins or in tangible goods. Black markets rapidly emerged where only transactions based on true silver content were accepted. The government attempted to legally enforce the acceptance of the debased coins, but enforcement proved impossible across an empire characterized by slow communication. The visibility of the debasement thus imposed a natural limit on the government's ability to inflate. If they reduced the silver content too quickly or too obviously, the population would revolt or outright reject the currency. Rome hit this physical limit around 268 AD, forcing the government to temper its pace once the denarius became almost entirely bronze. America's debasement is fundamentally invisible. Paper dollars printed in 1971 look functionally identical to those printed in 2025, both are just paper fiat instruments. Digital dollars are even more abstract. When the Federal Reserve digitally creates $5 trillion, it is merely an instantaneous entry in a computer ledger. The average citizen does not witness the money creation itself, they only experience the side effect, inflation, months or years later, and crucially, they rarely connect inflation directly back to the monetary expansion. This invisibility means there is no natural limit to debasement. The government can create trillions of dollars without immediate public visibility. By the time citizens finally recognize the impact through surging inflation, the massive upward wealth transfer has already been finalized. Rome was constrained by the physical detectability of its currency. America faces no such structural limit. This allows America to debase its currency far further, far faster, before the terminal crisis hits. But when that crisis breaks, it will be sudden and violent. While Rome's currency deteriorated over 250 years, America's fiat currency could potentially collapse within 5 to 10 years once public trust is irrevocably broken. Difference 4. Globalization makes America more fragile than Rome. Rome was economically self-sufficient within its own boundaries. It produced staple foods in Egypt, North Africa, and Italy, mined essential metals in Spain and Dacia, and manufactured goods across various provincial cities. Trade with external regions such as China via the Silk Road or India via sea routes primarily involved luxury items. If this external trade ceased entirely, Rome could still survive. This self-reliance meant the Roman economy possessed deep resilience. If one region failed, others could typically compensate. For example, if grain shipments from Egypt were disrupted, North Africa could step up production. The empire had geographical redundancy. America represents the opposite extreme. Globalization has rendered the U.S. economy radically interdependent and exposed. America produces only about 15% of its manufactured goods and imports 85%. The annual trade deficit stands at $1 trillion. We rely on imports for steel, electronics, pharmaceuticals, rare earth minerals, and even basic consumer items. This dependency generates catastrophic fragility. If global trade routes are disrupted, American shortages appear immediately. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated this vulnerability. Semiconductor shortages halted auto production, and minor shipping delays quickly resulted in empty retail shelves. These were minor shocks. A major crisis, such as a conflict with China closing shipping lanes or a dollar collapse making imports completely unaffordable, would instantly create severe shortages of essential goods. Rome could utilize its internal resources to survive 20 years of crisis. America would face widespread shortages within months if global supply chains broke. This profound systemic fragility dictates that collapse will happen faster because the American system lacks necessary resilience. Difference 5. Rome's elite had skin in the game, America's elite have exit plans. Roman senators often served physically in the military, Julius Caesar fought personally in Gaul, Marcus Aurelius battled Germanic tribes, and Trajan personally led conquests. Critically, the Roman elite owned vast estates within the empire, meaning their wealth was primarily non-transferable land. If Rome collapsed, their fortunes collapsed with it. This created a powerful, albeit ultimately insufficient, incentive to preserve the system. They at least attempted reforms, such as Diocletian's currency reform and Constantine's sweeping administrative restructuring. They failed, but they tried, because the elite were fundamentally trapped within the system. America's elite operate under no such constraints, they possess comprehensive exit strategies. They own liquid assets globally, hold wealth denominated in multiple currencies, and often possess secondary citizenships or passports. When the U.S. faces terminal crisis, American billionaires can digitally transfer their wealth instantaneously to secure locations like Singapore, Dubai, Switzerland, or New Zealand. Their assets are digital, global, and mobile. They are not trapped. This situation eliminates any genuine incentive to undertake the painful process of fixing American problems. Why reform a decaying system when the smarter strategy is to extract the maximum possible wealth and then simply leave? The contemporary American elite are stripping assets from the U.S. system much like barbarian warlords looted Rome, only they are doing it legally, via corporate structures and tax havens. Rome's elite also exploited the empire, but because they couldn't easily leave, collapse stretched over centuries.
America's elite can vanish instantly, meaning they will extract wealth faster and more aggressively because they have zero vested interest in preserving the system's longevity. These 5 differences unanimously point toward a single outcome: a significantly faster collapse. Technology instantaneously accelerates the spread of information and crisis. The lack of an expansion option removes the critical escape valve.
Invisible currency debasement eliminates natural monetary limits.
Globalization strips the economy of necessary resilience. And the elite's exit options remove all internal incentives for systemic reform. Rome required 250 years from the onset of its crisis, 235 AD, to its final collapse, 476 AD. America began its equivalent crisis in 2008. If the projected tenfold acceleration rate holds, America will reach the terminal fall state by 2033, just 11 years from now. But here is the profound, critical insight that almost everyone misses. The Roman analogy remains intensely useful, not because we are fated to repeat Rome's history detail for detail, but because Rome provides a textbook example of the universal mechanisms of imperial decline.
Currency debasement transfers wealth.
Military overextension drains core resources.
Political dysfunction ensures that reform is impossible.
Wealth inequality destroys social cohesion. Bread and circuses successfully pacify the populace but solve nothing. Birth rate decline and resulting immigration stress the bonds of loyalty.
And external enemies inevitably exploit internal weakness.
These mechanisms are universal. They functioned in Rome, they function in America, and they will function in every empire that follows.
However, the timeline is highly variable.
Rome's timeline spanned 250 years because information was slow, expansion was possible, debasement was visible, the economy was decentralized and self-sufficient, and the elite were physically trapped.
America's timeline is compressed to 25 to 30 years because information moves instantly. Expansion is impossible. Debasement is invisible. The economy is fragile and globalized. And the elite can exit. The core mechanisms of decline are identical, the speed of the timeline is the definitive difference.
Understanding the timeline is therefore exponentially more important than understanding the mechanisms, because the timeline dictates precisely when you must prepare. Anyone preparing for a slow, 250-year Roman-style decline will be catastrophically unprepared when the American system breaks apart in the 2030s. They will expect decades of gentle, gradual decline, but they will experience a sudden, compressed currency crisis, supply chain collapse, and political breakdown condensed into 5 to 10 years. The Roman comparison teaches you what to watch for, but the structural differences teach you when to act. Let me now outline the specific timeline, based on Roman mechanisms but filtered through American acceleration. Rome's catastrophic crisis of the 3rd century lasted 50 years, 235 to 284 AD, marked by 26 emperors, continuous debasement, barbarian invasions, plague, and economic collapse, followed by a temporary stabilization achieved through the authoritarian reforms of Diocletian. The American equivalent started with the 2008 financial crisis. Applying the tenfold acceleration factor means 50 years becomes 5 years, except America's stabilization came by resorting to massive money printing rather than implementing meaningful structural reform. The sequence of QE1, QE2, and QE3 merely acted as a set of financial palliatives, postponing a looming crisis 3 times without actually resolving any underlying issues.
Then, the COVID-19 pandemic struck in 2020.
In response, the Federal Reserve injected an astonishing $5 trillion into the system over just 2 years.
This colossal monetary expansion marks America's true Gallienus moment.
Historically, Gallienus savagely debased the denarius, dropping its silver content from 40% to a mere 5% over 15 years, 253 to 268 AD. Comparatively, the Fed debased the dollar by roughly 20% in terms of purchasing power in just 2 years, 2020 to 2022.
What followed Gallienus's era in Rome?
A 5-year period of maximum acute crisis, 268 to 273 AD. The empire immediately began to fragment. The Gallic Empire broke away, the Palmyrene Empire broke away. The Roman state effectively shrank to little more than the Italian peninsula.
This chaos was followed by the temporary stability achieved when Aurelian reconquered the lost territories and stabilized the borders. If this historical pattern holds true, applying our 10x acceleration factor suggests that the period from 2022 to 2027 will constitute the phase of maximum crisis in the US. We should anticipate widespread banking failures, extreme currency stress, profound political breakdown, and perhaps even significant state-level resistance to federal authority. This will then be followed by a phase of temporary stabilization around 2027 to 2028, likely achieved through sharply authoritarian measures. We can expect a vast expansion of federal control, the likely implementation of a central bank digital currency, CBDC, and the imposition of harsh capital controls. This brief, forced respite is America's analogous Aurelian moment. But what comes next? In the Roman timeline, the stabilization Aurelian established lasted approximately 14 years, leading up to Diocletian's comprehensive reforms in 284 AD. Diocletian's system then lasted for 20 years, followed by Constantine's subsequent reforms, which endured for another 30 years. Rome achieved a state of managed stability from 284 to 337 AD, a stability enforced through authoritarian political control, rigid price ceilings, systematic currency reform, and drastic administrative restructuring. Crucially, though, the Western Empire still collapsed in 476 AD. These reforms succeeded only in buying precious time; they utterly failed to resolve the fundamental, systemic issues. The Eastern Empire survived by making a brutally rational strategic decision, cutting its losses. It decisively abandoned the West, concentrated its resources on defending its core territories, Anatolia and Egypt, and consequently lasted another 1,000 years. If America proceeds along this pattern with 10x acceleration, the temporary stabilization period, beginning around 2027 to 2028, will last only until 2032 to 2033, a mere 5 to 6 years. At that point, the entire reform system will shatter because these measures fundamentally fail to resolve the underlying debt mathematics. It is at this breaking point, roughly 2033 to 2035, that America will confront the Constantine question. Constantine famously moved the capital to Constantinople in 330 AD, effectively abandoning the struggling West in a calculated move to preserve the East. Will America be forced to abandon half its global empire to save its domestic core? Will it execute a massive strategic retreat from Europe and Asia to focus solely on defending the homeland? Or will the US simply splinter into competing regional powers? Rome required 241 years in total, from the start of the 3rd century crisis in 235 AD to the formal deposition of the last Western emperor in 476 AD, to complete its transition. With our 10x acceleration, America's collapse sequence, starting in 2008, reaches crisis completion in just 24 years, placing the final fall state around 2032. However, fall does not equate to a Mad Max scenario. Rome in 476 AD did not simply vanish, it fragmented. The Eastern Empire continued its reign, and various regional kingdoms emerged across the West. Life continued, albeit with significantly lower living standards, massively reduced trade volume, and decentralized, localized power structures. America's collapse will likely mirror this pattern. The federal government will steadily lose effective authority. States will aggressively assert regional control. The dollar will lose its preeminent global reserve currency status, though it will likely survive for domestic use. Global trade will shrink dramatically, and living standards will plummet. This isn't the apocalypse, it is analogous to Argentina or perhaps Russia in the 1990s, where a formerly wealthy, sophisticated nation suddenly becomes dramatically poorer in a very short amount of time. The Roman comparison corrected for the 5 key differences that mandate an accelerated timeline suggests America enters the acute crisis phase between 2025 and 2027. This is followed by temporary authoritarian stabilization, 2027 to 2032, and finally, a systemic break, 2032 to 2035. That entire sequence spans a maximum of 10 years, not 250 years. Crucially, the mechanisms of collapse will be identical to Rome: a crippling currency crisis, cascading bank failures, catastrophic supply chain disruptions, political breakdown, regional fragmentation, and external enemies exploiting profound weakness, all compressed into a single decade instead of unfolding over centuries. Now, here is the critical action you must take with this information.
The Roman parallel confirms that collapse is not merely possible, but mathematically inevitable, given the unmanageable national debt, extreme currency debasement, and crippling military overextension. The differences between the empires, however, specify the timeline, 10 to 20 years, not 200 years.
This acute contraction of the timeline creates profound urgency.
If you had 200 years, you could afford to wait and observe. With only 10 to 20 years left, positioning must begin immediately. Preparing for an accelerated Roman-style collapse requires a clear understanding of what assets actually survived the original Roman sequence.
What survived?
Hard, physical assets, productive land, durable buildings, tangible commodities, essential skills, and robust local networks.
What did not survive?
Currency, government bonds, promises from a failed state, urban wealth reliant on fragile global trade, pensions, and any savings denominated in the debased denarius.
The same principles will govern America's collapse, utilizing modern equivalents. What will survive?
Real assets, strategically located real estate, commodities, useful skills, and cohesive local communities.
What will be wiped out?
Dollar savings, treasury bonds, 401k retirement accounts, complex financial assets, pensions, and anything denominated in dollars that relies on the stability of the federal government or the continuation of global trade.
The Roman comparison is a blueprint for the mechanisms of decline.
The key differences reveal the compressed timeline. Combining both shows you precisely how to position your life and assets for what is coming.
Rome also provides a stark lesson on elite survival. They survived by holding hard assets and maintaining geographical mobility.
Roman senators who wisely owned estates in the more stable provinces such as North Africa or the eastern provinces not only survived but thrived within the continuing Eastern Empire.
In contrast, senators who kept their assets tied up in Italy and depended heavily on the institutions of Rome were utterly destroyed when the Western Empire finally collapsed.
The American elite are already perfectly positioned for this outcome. They hold vast global assets, possess multiple passports, maintain offshore accounts, and own real estate in stable foreign countries. They are systematically executing the playbook of the clever Roman elite, geographically diversifying their wealth and stocking up on hard assets.
Meanwhile, the middle class is repeating the exact mistake made by their Roman counterparts, relying heavily on currency and government promises. The Roman middle class clung to debased denarii and naively trusted the government to eventually fix the economy.
The American middle class clutches dollars and 401k accounts, trusting that the federal government will preserve the existing financial system.
Both assumptions are disastrously wrong.
The Roman middle class was entirely wiped out. The American middle class is in the process of being destroyed right now through relentless inflation and asset appreciation that exclusively benefits those who already possess tangible assets.
If you are not positioned like the Roman elite, then you are positioned like the Roman plebeians.
And history is unequivocal about what happened to them. This Roman comparison is not an exercise in pessimism, it is precise pattern recognition. Empires that simultaneously face unpayable debt, crushing military overextension, and debilitating political dysfunction inevitably collapse. The speed of that collapse varies based on 5 key factors: available technology, expansion options, currency visibility, economic resilience, and the incentives held by the elite.
Rome experienced a slow, drawn-out collapse because all 5 of those factors created inertia.
America is set for a hyper-fast collapse because all 5 of those factors are now driving radical acceleration. But the ultimate outcome is precisely the same: currency crisis, sustained economic decline, political breakdown, drastically reduced living standards, and ultimate regional fragmentation.
The American empire is not just repeating history, it is following the Roman playbook on an accelerated timeline. The next 10 years will witness the equivalent of what Rome experienced over 250 years. The mechanisms are identical. The timeline is ruthlessly compressed. The outcome is entirely predictable. And unlike the fall of Rome, where historians continue to debate whether the collapse was truly inevitable, for America, we possess mathematical certainty. The national debt stands at $36 trillion and continues to balloon. Annual interest payments are already $900 billion and rising fast. The currency is actively being debased. The military is cripplingly overextended. The political system is structurally dysfunctional.
Wealth inequality is spiraling out of control.
The birth rate is below replacement level. And external enemies are expertly positioned to exploit the coming weakness.
Every single parallel Rome exhibited in 235 AD, America exhibits in 2025 AD. But America has them far worse, compounded by massive acceleration factors.
Rome needed 250 years to fall. America will not take 25.
If this analysis has demonstrated to you that the Roman comparison is accurate, yet nearly everyone misjudges the timeline.
If you now understand that the inherent differences accelerate, rather than prevent, the collapse.
And if you see that 2032 to 2035 represents the likely crisis completion date, based on Roman mechanisms and American acceleration factors,
then subscribe.
Because the next video will explore the other empires, Spain, 150 years, Britain, 100 years, that followed this exact pattern at varying speeds. The timeline for each empire was determined by the critical variables of technology, available expansion options, and elite geographic mobility. Truly understanding the variables that determine the timeline is the key to knowing when to proactively prepare versus realizing you are already too late.
Rome teaches the mechanisms of failure. The modern differences teach the brutal speed of the timeline. Both together confirm that you are living through an empire collapse compressed into a single generation.
10 years from now, America will look as radically different from today as Rome in 476 AD looked compared to Rome in 235 AD, the same country in name, but a completely transformed reality on the ground.
Welcome to the accelerated Roman collapse.